Okay, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and this one is going to be with Maelk, who is a Danish Dota player. People are like, wait a minute, player? No, he's like an analyst. You know, maybe he's done some commentary from time to time. Like, no, actually, for all you kids out there, once upon a time, not only did Maelk play, I'm not talking about Dota2. You know, he did that stuff later, and that was, but he was actually a pretty good Dota player. So I'm reliably informed. So we're going to find out if that's indeed the case. So let's start at the beginning, right? Because one of the unique things about you in terms of someone who's still around as a figure is that you were actually there from the very, very early days of Dota. Like, people won't realize this, but just to give people like broad strokes, until Dota 2, Dota, the first version, the Warcraft 3 mod, basically wasn't a big esports game. It had esports, it had tournaments, but they were like sort of its own lands, and it was a smaller circuit, and there was a lot of online play. And so, forget the end of Dota. At the beginning of Dota, the esports aspect, it was all just grassroots, it was all community driven. And so, there's very few people from back then, like maybe a couple of Chinese players still around, but there's not that many. And so, to actually have someone, were you there at the very beginning of Dota? Because I know you were playing in like 2005 or something. It wasn't it 2004 first ever came out?
I can't actually remember what time it came out. I think there was even one in StarCraft, but for the actual competitive side of Dota, at least, I think that was late 2004 that we began playing it. And what we did was, I actually played Warcraft 3 semi-competitively before that. Yes. So in a sense that I was sponsored for the really old school people. They might remember WC3L. I played for Boomtown. Had a few other notable characters on there, such as Ralph Reveal. He was like a tower orc and stuff like that. So anyways, we needed something to sort of relax with when we weren't practicing Warcraft.
Yes.
And then Dota became that game, and some of us realized that Dota was a lot more entertaining to us, and we actually preferred playing Dota to Warcraft at some point. So we decided to sit down and practice as 5, because Dota way back then was also 5-on-5, luckily. And there was nothing to really practice or play in. But then, as it happened in 2000, and I believe it was the summer of 2005, Dota League came around. DotaLeague.com was this massive hub for the regular Dota All-Stars, or Dota 1, in which everyone would play public games through it, in the system called SIG, S-I-G, okay. Single instant game. And then, obviously, it had the actual Dota League component, in which the best teams in the world, or at least in Europe, would play from. And for the longest time, Europe was the only region that mattered in competitive Dota. So yeah, we began back then. And I think the only people currently in the scene that was also around back then is Enes from the Russian broadcast team,
okay,
who played for Virtus.pro most of his career. Merlini is still back. Okay. He's not playing, but he's still around in Dota. And then Fear Darkness. So Oh, Poppy as well. Poppy was actually trash back then. He played in a league called DCE. It was known as Poppy 41 Hydra, and he was terrible in comparison to what he is now. But it took him 2 or 3 years to really break through competitively.
Okay. By the way, when you were talking there, could you hear anything coming in my mic? Like, could you hear any like kids or anything?
No.
Right, okay, that's good. I'm just checking, because the thing is, I have to have my window open, and like there's some kids I could hear outside. But as long as it's not picking up on the mic, it's fine.
Okay.
Right. So, okay, since you mentioned you were a Warcraft 3 player, you're playing for Boomtown, which, by the way, I actually remember, because once upon a time, many years before that, actually, they had a CS team. It was obviously a Danish organization. In fact, I think it came from a LAN cafe. I think that's what Boomtown was, right, presumably. So here's the question. I heard that while you were playing Warcraft 3, and as you say, on the side, you were playing Dota, and funnily enough, that's how the game actually became popular. I remember the way everyone heard about it was like CS players as well. When they finished doing the practice for fun, you'd play some games of Dota with some other people, and it's a very relaxed environment, I heard this bizarre scenario where part of the reason you also went super hard into Dota was that in Warcraft 3, there was some sort of like minor scandal where you were like fake nicking as some other name, and you got like some sort of punishment from a league. Is there anything to this? Were you a bad boy, Maelk?
I actually wasn't. So what happened was the Reveal, who's also my best friend, still is one of my best friends. He and I played on Boomtown together. We were both orc players. We were both tower orcs. He in a much bigger degree than I was, but admittedly, I did use a lot of towers. And so I was on holidays, and we were playing the WC3L qualifier, and I was in the registered lineup, yet I couldn't log in to play from anywhere, and I didn't know why they would have put me in the registered lineup. You know, that's a management issue. But since we were so close friends, he would log into my account and he would just play in my name because we had very similar playstyles. We both played orc, and he knew my password just because we were best friends. Note to self: never do that again. I never trusted anyone with my password since.
Okay.
So I actually did not know about it. It did become somewhat of a scandal. I wouldn't say it was really, throughout esports, there's been a lot of scandals. This wasn't one of them. Sure. It was like a sort of a non-scandal. We got a ban for it, and Reveal took all the repercussions, also owned up to the fact that it was indeed his doing without my approval. So that is actually the story to it all. But we didn't do Dota because we were banned or anything, because it was only a one-season ban as well. It wasn't. It wasn't really a big deal, and he lost the game anyways. He lost both of his games. He lost his own game, and he lost in my name as well. So it made me look bad.
But this was around the time, though, when Dota started to take off more competitively for you, right? Because it wasn't shortly after this where you got obviously some people are going to know Loda, Arcade. These came into playing in a team with you. So in light of that, you just contrasted Poppy there. What was young Loda like? Because remember, everyone in Dota 2 only knows him as a veteran, and people, by the time they even encounter him, they know of things he's done in the past. What was he like at this early stage?
So I'm actually glad you asked, because one of the things I think and talk a lot about with people in esports these days is how, especially in Dota, because so many players are still around that played 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it's how they grow up with the game, but they also grow as human beings, right? Loda was hugely talented, by large and far one of the best players the world had ever seen in Dota for the longest time back then. But he was also sort of a brat, a spoiled guy. I think most of us was. That's not to out him or anything. I think most of us had obnoxious attitudes. I know I had. So it's funny to look back and see what we were like when we were these young kids. We were 17, 18 years old. And then look at us now when we're in our late 20s, or in my case, I'm 31, and just see how we've progressed as human beings. So Loda back then was, he had a big ego, he had a big personality, and he took up a lot of space, which is one of the reasons for why he was hard to put in a team with other star players, because when we created MYM, it was mostly centered around having a lot of star players, and as I mentioned, I also had a huge ego, and so did a lot of the other players that we tried to fit into the various lineups that we did. So Loda was, a great player by all means, but also had a huge ego back then.
So back in these days, we're talking now about, just over about 10 years ago, like going like 2005, 2006, this kind of era when you had this team. Back in this particular era, had there already begun to be the international LANs? Was this where it was mainly just online cups you were playing?
Predominantly, it was just online play. There was a few outside of Dota League. There was some ESL tournaments and a lot of other small-time tournaments tried to break through because they saw that there was this, grassroots kindred spirit kind of thing going with Dota, and it was interesting, but no one really knew how to professionalize it the same way that Warcraft and Counter-Strike was at the time with WC3L. So it wasn't until I had my first international LAN in the winter of 2007 when we went to a tournament called Fire and Ice in Chicago. And I was really, really sick. I went anyways just because I was so excited to play an international tournament, meet all the American teams and so forth. But I was like, borderline dying. 13-hour plane rides in economy to Chicago with my nose was just running constantly, and I was coughing, and I had this big gangbanger Mexican next to me who was hating on me. So it was a terrible trip. I thought I was gonna either die from the illness or from him killing me afterwards when we got off the flight. But yeah, that was the first one. And then the ESWC started coming along and other tournaments, but it was really, really slow. DreamHack was actually also the other first LAN tournament that we really attended, where MYM was created for.
Sure. So back in these days, a lot of people might know that the famous line that you hear about Dota 2 is that, oh, it's basically like Dota with updated graphics, and they kept a lot of the core mechanics, because obviously with a lot of the Dota clones, that was one of the key aspects, was what did they do with those elements? Did they change it up? Like, obviously they made it radically different in League of Legends, you know. Is that just a good line for beginners to give them the basics? Was this version of Dota you were playing, the first one, was it very similar to what Dota 2 was? Obviously, we're not talking about the most recent change to Dota 2. It's pretty radical. But when Dota 2 first came out, those first few years, was it quite similar? Were there any key differences in the original version?
It was essentially the same. So, I mean, if we fast forward to the tournament of 2011, namely the international, the first international, we had all the teams participating had access to the Dota 2 beta for around 2 weeks, and Dota All-Stars had 100 heroes available, and Dota 2 had around 30 or 40 of those heroes available to you at the time, and it was, you know, there were so many bugs in it, but the key aspects of the game were mostly identical. You know, whenever Dota 1 would be balanced, Dota 2 would follow that balance. So it was essentially the same game, but obviously a smaller version of it, just because there wasn't as many heroes available.
Since it was very much like literally a grassroots game where the people developing it were part of the community, and in theory, because it wasn't a big esport, they were essentially directly interacting with the very people playing their game and who were pros, etc., and maybe even playing games with them. Was the balance in Dota? Were they vigilant about it? Did they keep on top of it? Did they allow things to become overpowered and a certain mechanic could be super OP for a while? How did they manage back then? Because obviously nowadays the pressure comes from the business side of things. People want the game to be balanced for the pros and for the fans. Back then it's just a little game, right?
I mean, a little game, but with a huge community already. DotaAllStars.com had, I think, one of the biggest gaming communities, and I think IceFrog is a genius in his own right. He always, you know, he would ask most of the relevant pro players for input throughout, you know, all time. Basically, I think he still does. Since I'm no longer relevant, I'm not one being consulted, but I'm pretty convinced that he still asks pro players to this date what should be changed and everything. Obviously, as he grew with the game, so did his confidence in his own abilities to, you know, be able to dissect what is going on in the meta and what is imbalanced and so forth. But I think the big strength was that not only was he a genius and able to see 3 steps ahead of everyone else of what he wanted to do with all the different balance changes, but he also, you know, he was respectful and humble enough to take in other people's input and always consulted a lot with the pro scene, as well as his beta tester team for the public aspect. So he always tried to find this balance between casual play and competitive play, but definitely had at least that's my impression, he had this forte for the pro scene. He really wanted Dota as an esport before the term esport was even invented to succeed.
So, interestingly enough, if you contrast Dota in any of its versions with other esports games, it is very interesting because you don't really get periods where people are like, this one hero is just too broken, you know. It's like they can say it's broken. It can be, you know, if you're very good at that one, for example, yeah, maybe you thrive in this period. But you never hear it as bad as in some of the other games. I mean, when you say you played Warcraft 3, obviously famously in that game, by the end of it, if you were like an undead player, it was like 2 times harder to win the game against an orc player than the orc player's game. So that was ludicrously broken. In other games, we think of periods where they just allow certain things to go through cycles of being strong and then they make it weak next time, you know. I mean, people often say in League of Legends it's cynical, you know, they want to sell skins for one thing and then they want to switch up and sell skins for the other champion, you know. There was a famous comic that everyone's seen who's an old school gamer, which tried to elucidate the balance philosophies of the big games. And if you remember, it had StarCraft, and in StarCraft what they did was it showed that if one side, I mean, the way it showed it was there was two people and one of them had a weapon and the other one had a weapon. And what happened was in StarCraft, it's like one guy had the axe and the other guy had a little dagger. And then it was like, when the balance changes, all they do is they give the other guy the axe. It's like, right, you get to be OP now, and then he's fucked. And then they're like, oh, well, that's just life. And then I think in League of Legends, they just both had the little daggers. You remember this famous cartoon? They both just had tiny daggers. The idea was they just nerfed everything, so that's what made it roughly balanced. And then the Dota one was they both just had like one had a fucking axe, one had like a bazooka or something, And the joke was, the Dota philosophy in theory was you make it balanced because everything's OP in a way, and if you're really good with that hero, you're just going to be good anyway. Obviously, again, very broad strokes, but what has there been an element like this to the philosophy of how Dota's balanced?
To some extent, I think it goes both ways. I think Icebrock both nerfs, but he also buffs. And there's always, he's also been good at looking at the bigger picture. So a lot of people just looks at one hero and they see, his skill or one of his skills has been changed with a lower cooldown or a lower mana cost or a bigger damage output, and that might be one thing, like one way of looking at it, right? But he also does the much broader changes, so that he'll next level will be, he buffed this item, which by proxy makes these kind of heroes insanely good, or he nerfed this item, so this hero is all of a sudden good, or he nerfed this hero, meaning that this hero is all of a sudden good. That's the next level of it. But then he'd also take it to the very next level, in which he would do actual game changes to, for instance, the economy of the game, so that the gold tick would start coming in fast, and that would mean that carry heroes all of a sudden were a lot stronger, because suddenly they would have their item peaks in an earlier fashion that they would otherwise. So intelligence heroes were by proxy nerfed due to the fact that the gold gain on carry heroes, or for all heroes for that matter, was happened in a much more rapid pace. So in that way, I think he's done a great job at always trying to balance it the best way possible. That's not to say Dota's had its fair share of very imbalanced heroes. For Dota 1 or Dota All-Stars, Spectre, for instance, whenever, like throughout all of Dota All-Stars, I think Spectre and Chen are the two heroes that stands out to me as being the most imbalanced at long periods of time. The thing is, that would only be in competitive play.
Yes.
So in public play, that wouldn't really stand out too much, because most of things were balanced in public play. Sure enough, when we went into Dota 2, there's been times where heroes have been notably imbalanced as well. There was a Earth Spirit cycle or patch. There was a Lycanthrope patch. There was a Bloodseeker patch. So there's been heroes who's been hugely imbalanced, but throughout most of it, it's always been, first of all, it's been very quickly patched if it was too imbalanced, but it's also, the meta sort of developed into a pace where you could suddenly start finding counters for this. It just so happened that the public, or like everyone but Icebrock, would need to figure it out on their own. So in that regard, he sort of he challenged the player base to find ways of dealing with things on their own, and successfully so. I think that's one of the reasons for why we see a game that has 110 heroes or more, and it's still regarded as mostly balanced, like ideally balanced, even not perfectly, but very close to.
Is there a particular era or meta that suited Maelk the best? Was there ever one where either your heroes were just all in vogue, or something about the way the meta was played competitively, that this was just like the time to be Maelk?
I mean, around 6.48b, I think that was when MYM and myself peaked. I've gone through all sort of roles throughout my career. I actually used to be, I started out a carry player, went to become a mid player when I played a lot of Queen of Pain and such, played some offlane as well, until I then settled on support, because the competitive meta changed in a way where the more experienced players would be the ones needed on the support role, and I like to play Chen a lot because of my Warcraft background, and it's micro intensive. So I'd say around the different versions in which Chen was really, really strong, which I think he was throughout most of Dota 1 and into the first 2 years or so of Dota 2. Whenever we'd be able to get Chen, I think lineups revolving around that was really my forte, just because of how good the hero was and how good I made the hero look. Like, it's not to say, I wasn't, especially in the later stages of my career, I was becoming a very irrelevant player in terms of mechanical skill compared to all the new breakouts. Especially today, I look trash in comparison to the Sumails and the Miracles and everything. But back then, Chen was one of the heroes that I could still look like a top tier world elite player on. Like, but my hero pool narrowed down a lot as the game progressed.
So, since you referenced MYM, so the team Meteor Makers, sadly, to almost anyone from like the last 10 years, they're going to think to themselves, oh, that was sort of like a budget org, right? And they had a lot of scandals surrounding them. But people have to realize when MYM first came into the scene, they were actually one of the first organizations to get outside investment. And so famously, in the other games at least, Warcraft, CS most famously, they literally went out and just headhunted the best guys in the world, overpaid them, if anything. They were kind of like the EG of their days. That's how they ensured everyone said yes. They just said, like, oh, I'll pay you 3 times more than anyone else.
Well, you say overpay, but it's important to take note of that when we say overpay, they paid the most successful Warcraft players of all time back then, like Susuri and Ghost Up. Moon they had as well, but he was paid vastly more because of how big of a profile he was. He was like the faker of the time. But they actually paid Susuri and Ghost Up 300 euros each. And this was an outrage, and MYM was the money club that just threw cash at it. But it was 300 euros. Sure. Today that's it's completely irrelevant. People are like, oh, okay, you only paid 300 euros. I think there's 20 teams in Denmark alone who's paid 300 euros or more. Yeah. But back then, that's what a top tier player was actually salarized. So it's sort of ridiculous in hindsight.
Sure,
continue.
But since Dota wasn't actually like a big esport at the time, did being part of MYM actually, did you get a good salary at the time? Was it mainly to have the ability to go to LANs, etc.? What were the benefits of being an MYM for a Dota player?
I mean, so the first salary we negotiated was 100 euros a month. That was late 2006, 2007, I think. And then, of course, the LAN support. And LAN support meant getting a hotel room in the crappiest hotel you could find in, for instance, Jönköping, where DreamHack took place. You would sleep at like a cabin, but we'd still have to figure out how to get there ourselves. That was the very first one. So we drove there by car, we slept in the car. And then the second one, esports developed a bit. So now we would actually have the car or the gas of the car paid at least. We'd still sleep at cabin. And then, that progression continued, but through it all, when I played for MYM, I think my peak salary was at 300 euros, and that was 2009.
So this was obviously your period in MYM, not only where you are most known because of the results, but also where, in theory, this team was one of the great teams. People fondly remember this team and reference it whenever they talk about the Dota teams. What was this team like at its best? Who were the stars of the team? How did the team operate? Why were you the best, do you think?
First and foremost, we had a very, in a sense, we had a relaxed approach to the game because we were so self-confident. We'd always look for the very best players in the world. We'd managed to always appeal the best players in the world. And the core of the team would always be myself and Mania. And he and I just had a drive like no one else. Mania also had a background in Warcraft 3. So we applied ourselves in every way possible to really master the game and master the strategies. And so we would make up this core of the team, and we'd always be on the forefront of strategies. Whenever you saw a strategy, we made it. So tri-laning, we came up with that. Sure enough, for tri-laning in particular, we took some inspiration from the Philippines, but for tri-laning we came up with that. We popularized it. Jungling, we came up with that. We popularized it at DreamHack. Merlini played it with the Jungle Beastmaster, and everyone was losing their mind because what is this? So everything was new. No one had come up with anything, and so we had that creative freedom. And I think we just from the very get-go, we wanted it more than everyone else. We think Dota 24 hours a day. Nowadays everyone does that with whatever game they're asserting themselves in. But back then that was actually quite the time investment. We dreamed Dota, we talked Dota, all we did was Dota. Whenever I'd spent 8 to 16 hours in a LAN center playing Dota, right? And then whenever I take the long walk home, I'd just be on the phone constantly with my co-captains talking about what strategies we would come up with and everything. And then I'd go to sleep, but I would lie and dream Dota. I would dream up these strategies, and my whole life was centered around Dota. And that made us, a great team and great players to play with. And we attracted this talent. So we had Merlini in his prime, we had Fear Darkness in his prime, we had Loda in his prime, RK in his prime. At one point we even had Kuroky in his prime. He just won TI. So not in his prime, right? Because he just won TI. But we had Kuroky. And I think we had a lot of the most, some of the most famous people throughout time has been a part of MYM at some point or another. But yeah, the core was really Mania and myself. We got a very selfless support player called Pusher Street, who, from a personality perspective, was a big part of why we were successful. He was a backbone of the team, but he was much worse in terms of mechanical skill, but that didn't matter because he brought something else to the team, and he was very selfless. People talk of the term a warding bitch. Martin, or Pusher Street, actually, was the reason for why that role and that term was invented, because he was the ward bitch. He'd run out, put a ward, he'd have nothing but brown boots in his inventory, and all he did was die. Before I was on the Venomancer and went 0-20, Martin already did that for 100 games or so. I think we just really had this very laxed approach to the game where we trusted each other. We had a lot of fun with the game, and we felt like we could make any strategy viable. So it was always reinventing the meta, basically, was what put us ahead of the curve.
Since you said part of the reason to shift to support was that the veteran players were kind of taking up these roles. Obviously, that's one of the areas where Dota has been notably distinct from games like League of Legends, is that in theory, support is a bit more of a cerebral role. You're not literally just supporting people. You're also dictating some element of the more macro elements of the play, whereas perhaps the carry is just focused on trying to get as much CS as possible. In this era, when you talk about all these big names you just listed off, who aren't Danish, notably most of them, except like Pusher and Mania, etc., was it mainly that the core were just the Danish players, and then the other stars kind of came and went, and you were able to replenish that role?
Yeah, I think so. I think the core of Mania, Pusher Street, and myself was the most successful, and then Merlini was like the closest to a foreigner that was always with the team. But Ben was busy at the time, so he's a Duke graduate. He was, studying to become a doctor. He's a very charismatic guy, and had, he had other things going for him that made him sort of erratic in how much time he would devote to the game. So he was just always a part of our family, so to speak, but he'd come and go, right? 1 month he'd be there and he'd play and practice full time, the next he wouldn't, and so forth. So the core was the three of us, and then we'd add on other people. At one point I think we were like 9 or 10 people in the MYM roster, just because we wanted to have all the best talent, but because no one was paid in full, right? No one received salaries that they could live off. You couldn't ask for people to commit to a 5-man roster and always be there for practice and all the matches, because that's a full-time job. So I think we had most often we had at any given time, we had 7 people attached to the roster, and throughout some periods we even had 9 people. They were all, world-class players. And we'd just interchange. People would come on, oh, you want to play today? Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll sit over. And it was very friendly. It was a great environment to play in. I miss those days more than anything. Not just because we were very dominant, but also because we had a lot of fun. Sure.
So when you said that your team kind of invented jungling, when I went back and I looked through all the different players you had, whose job at different times would be to be a ganker, you had most of the players that everyone references. You had Mania, you had Merlini, you had another Danish player called Miggle at one point in time. You had all these different players. What does that mean that you invented it? People just didn't do this before? They just stayed in their lanes and they didn't have a dedicated player to go and do this?
Yeah, there was these set roles of how the game should be played. I remember us doing the tri-lane, right? We went to a DreamHack. We played the grand final on stage. and we'd come up with this tri lane. It was Crystal Maiden, Vengeful Spirit, and Tiny. Very at that point in time, that was a lot of spell output on a very early level with a lot of disable involved. And the other, like when we'd practice it ahead of the tournament, people would say, stop laming, stop cheating, and things like this, because this was, imagine everyone driving cars with 3 wheels, and suddenly this car comes along and has 4 wheels, and people are like, what the fuck is going on? So they're just like, everyone is like losing their shit because it's so very dominant that no one knows how to play against it. But at the same time, you're not following the standards, right? These are not within the community rule set of how you can approach the game. So everyone was like, stop doing that. You're being lame. Like, stop. At the grand final, when fans would come up to us afterwards, they were like saying we were being disrespectful and making fun of our enemy. But this was a perfectly viable strategy that would move on to become one of the most used ways of trying to dominate your opponent. And back then, this is what happened with most of the things we did, right? People would always be, so outraged with what we were trying to pull off. That being said, I think Merlini's jungling in particular, that was received pretty well. But at that point in time, it was sort of starting to gain notoriety or respect when you'd come up with something that hadn't been seen before. But like for the tri lane, for instance, that was just an outrage, almost a scandal.
So when the MYM period ended, mainly because the organization itself basically died off. Like, one of the reasons why everyone has now heard of MYM in negative terms is because after this great period where they were flush with all this money and investment, it wasn't just the fault of the team. There was a global recession, a few people might remember. And so as a result, as the world kind of trimmed the fat of all their marketing budgets, obviously esports was one of the things that died away. And as a result, investing in esports became kind of like a very low priority for people. So as MYM died off, you went to another Danish organization, well, technically Danish. It was one called Roskilde Ravens, which I remember very briefly from CS, was around at like a semi-pro level. And you went to an international tournament, Maelk. You went to a tournament in Malaysia. You went to a tournament called SMM. And this was one where... Well,
the team did. I didn't.
You didn't? Oh, you were out of the team at this point in time.
No. I was... So at this point in time, this is where... the beginning of the end of my playing career starts, because this is where I start getting other obligations, other commitments, other interests in life. Girls starts to seem appealing to me. Education seems to be a great thing. Work and everything. Especially, again, you couldn't do esports full time back then because the pay just wasn't there. So I started getting these other obligations. The team went to SMM. They had Kuroky alongside, I think.
Because this is where infamously they did quite poorly, right? So I wanted to kind of know how did the dominance of that era of, obviously a lot of different players in it, but the kind of the core, how did it kind of wind down?
This is where I think Southeast Asia was considered actually the world's best, between Mushi and Yamate and HY, who some might remember from the Valve documentary Free to Play.
Yes.
These 3 players really made up the different variations of cores of Southeast Asia, in which they would, dominate the world, and they would have been able to in a much bigger way if it wasn't because they were from, countries who couldn't really afford sending teams, couldn't really afford big sponsorships, couldn't really put them out there. So they were very constrained within their region, and the only tournaments they could really attend were ESWC, who paid for travel expenses, and then SMM, which was in Kuala Lumpur. But they were, I think, in hindsight, the Southeast Asian region around 2009 and 2010 was the best region until eHome came into the scene. The Chinese super team that still has players from
Burning, etc. Right?
Exactly. Weapon X, or Die as he was called, MMY. He has these 3 different names. Was also on it. He was by far the best mid laner that anyone had ever seen back then. Burning, the best carry that anyone had ever seen. So Asia as a whole really dominated the Dota scene in around 2009, 2010, and then. We were just lucky in MYM and in Roskilde Ravens, and then for in case of Virtus Pro and Na'Vi as well. We were lucky that the West got so much attention because in reality, I think Asia was the better and the stronger region, but we were just much better at putting it out there. But I say that, but in China, they probably didn't give a rat's ass about us either. For them,
yes,
everything that mattered
their
was
own little
exactly.
Little
It's a world of its own. So for them, eHome was all that mattered. Royal GG and CSMJ, which was a big player back then, who actually didn't make a career for himself, surprisingly. But yeah, I think Southeast Asia and China were the stronger regions at the time, and then from the West, we had MYM and we had Virtus Pro, and then later on Na'Vi, who were the really, really strong teams.
So when you say that, then one of the interesting things to think about is when people are cut off and they're kind of in their own little ecosystem. And I often think of it like if you had like a little pool that was somehow cut off from like an ocean area. In theory, give it enough like millions of years, different things could evolve there that wouldn't otherwise. When there was interaction like this between Southeast Asia and between these Western teams, did they have a different meta? They innovated anything different? Were they just better players? What impressed you so much?
A bit of a bit of column A, a bit of column B. I think the Chinese players in general were just better players. I also think some of the aforementioned C players were also, in terms of raw talent and mechanical skill, better than the West. On top of that, the Chinese players seem to focus a lot on the carry. They played what we regarded as the famous 4 protect 1 kind of strategy, in which they would have one guy who would just farm up either a Medusa or a Phantom Lancer or a Spectre or something along those kind of heroes, and the other 4, all they would do is just run around, take fights without that particular carry hero, and make sure that he got enough space to farm up faster than the enemy carry. And it was regarded from a Western perspective, it was regarded as a very, very boring playstyle, but it was super efficient of that meta, and I think that's really how the Chinese put themselves ahead of the curve with the different variations of lineups they had. In the West, we were still caught up in that whole Blink Dagger meta that died out with 6.49, where 5 heroes would get a Blink Dagger. You'd fight constantly. There was no cooldown on the Blink Dagger. I mean, there was a cooldown on it, but when you took damage, you could still blink afterwards. You can't do that. So everyone played this very aggressive playstyle with Sang King and Lina and Sven and Lestrak and, disable heavy heroes with a lot of magic damage output. That was how the West liked to play it. So we eventually caught up to the whole play 4 protect 1 and everything. And then what the West did is they started pushing. So again, dating back to why Chen was such a favorable pick is just because he is or was the best hero for doing these push lineups where you could literally stand in your enemy's base, taking down their throne 15 minutes into the game, especially if they played these 4 protect 1 strategies. So there's always this ever-changing meta that would still be in a cycle. So it would be 4 protect 1 would be successful, but then pushing would come along and eradicate that meta, and then ganking would come along and eradicate the pushing lineup, because the way pushing revolves around 5 heroes meeting up in one lane, but you can't do that if one of your heroes are dead. Yeah. So people started ganking a lot, and then when people realized that everyone was ganking a lot, they would revert back to the 4 protect 1, because it doesn't matter if you lose one of the 4 heroes that are protecting, as long as your carry is still getting farmed. So that this cycle continued for years on end, until we're at where Dota is today, where everything is viable, every hero is viable, every kind of strategy is viable, and there's no set way of playing the game. It has exceeded the framework that it created for Dota 1, and now in Dota 2, everything is viable.
So when you describe the famous 4 protect 1 meta, and obviously the primary candidate of that was Burning, like you can see why, since he was in theory the best carry at the time. I've noticed actually China in a lot of esports games I've followed does a similar thing. Like they develop an internal meta, And here's the part where I feel like there's a disconnect internally for them, though, is they think to themselves, right, this is just the way you play because this is the best style. But I've noticed it nearly always comes from the style makes the most sense because you've got the best player at whatever position you're focusing on, whatever you're emphasizing. So, for example, the same thing happened in League of Legends. They had a scenario there where they always played around the AD carry because their best player in China at the time was an AD carry. It was a guy called Wei Zhao for World Elite. So, was it actually that this style, could the 4 Protect 1 style work well, even if you had just a good carry? Did he have to basically have Burning or someone of that level to really make it work?
Yeah, I think so. I think for the meta at the time, I think all of the carry players were the best players in the world. Okay. And then, also the mid laners, but mid lane could also be played as a carry. So it's definitely that for a lot of the lineups, the carry and the mid laner seemed like much better players than the rest of their team. I don't know if it was the meta that sort of dictated it or if it was actually true. But when I think back, I can almost only remember the carry players and the mid players. I can remember all players, but the standouts to me are always the carry and the mid laners. With a few exceptions being RK and Poppy and players like that really, really had an important part in why they were successful. But notice again, these are Chen and Enchantress players, These are two players that would be very strong in the meta where pushing was strong because they were so very good at playing those particular heroes. So one of the reasons why they stand out to me is because they were able to do so through pushing metas. But yeah, carry and mid laners were by far the most dominant players.
When you said you had Kuroky in your team, to clarify for people now, at the time he was a carry player, right? He was a one-position player, whereas people now will know him as a support player, and obviously he's kind of taken on obviously a much grander scale version of what you described, where you start out as a carry and you kind of gradually, he literally moved through all the roles till he got to the end, and now he's a captain, he's a support player. How would you describe, what was he like when he was a carry player and he was a much younger guy, and obviously many different teams ago?
Always, in some ways, I don't think he changed much. He's always been very quiet. He's very, he has this, he has his own way of perceiving the game, and he's very, very confident in his own way of perceiving the game, which makes him, unless he really respects the captain. So it needs to be said, I didn't actually play with Kuro. Kuro took over for me. So essentially, when I had a 6-month period in which I focused on my studies, he would be the captain of MYM, and they would run his strategies, and he would tell the team what to do. And what I was told was that he was a very, he was a very friendly guy, a very calm guy, but at the same time, it was sort of strategically, it was a dictatorship. It's his way. And people got to do it that way, and they got to stick within those lines of how to play the game. Whereas in my style, it was a much more of a
democracy.
It was a democracy in some ways. It was me trying to play to my players' strengths in the sense that I would say, which heroes does this guy really, really play really well? And then I would try and make up strategies around that. Whereas Kuroky's playstyle would be, which heroes are really good in the meta now? And then, designate those heroes to different players. And those two, one, I think like the way I did it would make players comfortable and happy to play and motivated to play because they would always play something they found to be funny to play. Because I would literally ask them, what do you want to play? Whereas Kuroky's was more, and this was something I've been told, time and time again for not just Kuroky, but other captains as well. Yeah. It would be much more of a, it would feel a lot more like a 9-to-5 job than a hobby that you had fun with. And so that inception of MYM didn't last long before the team, he actually left us on his own accord, but regardless, the team would have wanted to push him out as well, just because this wasn't how the core of MYM was born and raised, essentially, and so they, I came back, we went back to playing what we regarded as being fun, and Kuro went on to other teams, and he was successful with Navi, in which he played under Poppy, who I think have the same kind of approach to the game that Kuro does. And these are just different ways of approaching the game. There's no right or wrong. I think honestly, I think if you look at it today, I think the way I like to do things, it would be wrong. It's way too relaxed. It's way too offhand with your players. I think it's good to have a stern and firm approach to the game.
So as you mentioned, in the modern day of Dota, in theory, everything is viable. If anything, I think actually this is something which, to differing degrees, seems to exist in many esports games. It's more like, I've always described it like this. It always seems like the way you should play the meta tends to just be whatever the team that's the best and the dominant team is. It looks like, oh, they're showing us this is how you play the meta. But you have to realize, usually they didn't just sit down and calculate what would be the most efficient way? They just looked at who their personnel was, who were our stars, what style do they play best, and it came from that. They reverse engineered a really good style. And so if you don't have the personnel like that, obviously that might not work for you in general anyway. So ideally, games that are good are ones where you play to your own style, you play to your own personal strengths, and then you hope that gives you the best chance of winning. Since you say that Dota 2 was like that, and there was more of like a cycle of the metagame in the first Dota, what were you as a captain like in terms of, did you have the same philosophy throughout most of the game? Were you someone who was willing to just totally change to whatever the new thing that was popular was? What was your philosophy for Dota like? Do you have an idea of what the correct way to play the game is?
I think, well, first of all, I think I'm very open to all sorts of strategies. I think I had I was a bit biased towards pushing. I really liked pushing. I hated the carry playstyle just because I always felt like it put you on the back foot if you have to play the clock and hope that you ramp up and become big enough. Whereas I played the clock in the opposite direction, in which I would want to play the early game, which is it's sort of ironic because a lot of the MYM wins that we had was through farming up and just defending our base. But that was really just the outcome of us failing in the early game. It wasn't like we wanted to sit and drag out the game for 1 or 2 hours. It just so happened that we didn't want to lose the game, so we had to. I think I'm very narrow-minded, and I don't like change too much in how I approach strategies. So I wouldn't embrace new heroes the same way other people would, and I would always try to just still utilize the strength of what I felt comfortable with, and especially in my own play. It's a bit different with my team, because if they wanted to play something new, sure enough, I'd pick it for them. I wouldn't mind. That's great. Adds diversity. But myself as a player would often limit my teams because I wasn't willing to go outside my comfort zone in terms of my own hero pool, and I don't think I was devoted enough to actually assert myself with heroes that I really didn't feel comfortable with to begin with. So I wouldn't go out and play, when Puck entered. Believe it or not, Puck wasn't always in Dota. So when that came into the scene, I wouldn't practice it at all. And the result was we went to ESWC in San Jose in 2009. We picked up a puck. We had all intentions of putting it.
2008, but yeah.
Was it in 2008?
Yeah, that was the one where
okay.
it was in France all the other years, but yeah.
Yeah, so we pick up a puck with the intention of it going mid, but then the enemy picked a Broodmother, and we needed something else for the mid lane. But then all of a sudden, all the roles were filled up, and who was going to play the puck? Well, I had to. Didn't play a single game on the puck, and it was an unmitigated disaster. We lost the game in pretty hard, and my team to this day still mocks me because I didn't actually skill phase shift. I just skilled stats instead because I wasn't mechanical sound or didn't trust myself well enough to actually use the skill in due time anyways. So I'd rather just prefer the stats to have bigger damage output, bigger mana pool and HP gain and everything, which in hindsight is the dumbest thing I've ever done. But at the time, that was just a result of who I was as a player with the stubbornness of not learning new heroes. So I'm a bit too old-fashioned in how I approach the game, I think.
So there's this period in Dota history which I regard as kind of the black hole period, because Dota had gotten kind of underground cachet. It was known to be like one of the games that had a very vibrant scene but wasn't kind of recognized as an esport. It didn't have the full weight of all the big lands behind them. like the ones you're mentioning here, DreamHack, ESWC, these were famously tournaments which ran many, many games at one big LAN. You know, it wasn't like nowadays where there's one game at the tournament. But there's this period, I'd say it's roughly like, it's around, you know, like 2009 to basically when Dota 2 comes out, like 2011. This period here is where a lot of people, if you just looked at the history books, you'd think, oh, right, so everyone played Dota 1, and then, oh, look, yeah, I can see them all in Dota 2. So the olds played Dota 2. But actually, a lot of people tried their hand. They went off to, you know, HoN, obviously, people like Loda, they all went off and tried that, because famously people thought before Dota 2, that's going to be the new Dota, you know, this is the game that has the mechanics, you know, it's not like League, the little kids version, it's got the mechanics, it's got, you know, they're going for the hardcore audience. Then you also had, on the other side, League of Legends. In fact, some of the players you mentioned before, HY from CIS region, SEA region, went over to League of Legends initially, tried their hand there. Did Maelk just stay around Dota and wait for Dota 2? Did you ever try your hands at these other games? Did you ever think about moving to one of the at the time, people thought were going to be the Dota killers?
I never thought about it. I always stuck with Dota. We played 2 test games of League of Legends back at Gamescom. There was a tournament that was put on by Riot in Dota, which I think was won by Misery and Fnatic back then. Not entirely sure. Anyways, there was a Dota 1 tournament. It was put on by Riot, and it was, you know, sort of to promote League of Legends, obviously, and then also want us to play it. So we played like 2 test games. I played... I don't know what the hero is called, but it was sort of similar to Juggernaut. So I tried to play that. I don't know if it's even in the game anymore. And that's the only time I've ever tried my hands with both League of Legends and Heroes of Newerth. They just didn't appeal to me. And again, I think, you know, it trails back to me being so stubborn and not liking change. You know, I just stuck with what I knew, and I wasn't even open to the idea of trying something else. Also, at the time, I had a very, very close relationship to IceFrog. He took a lot of my input in how to approach the game alongside some of my other MYM allies. So it never even occurred to me to make the change. Really didn't.
So yeah.
Sorry. So yeah, as you were saying, Loda made the change. Arke made the change. They went to Heroes of Newerth. Hani as well. You know, it's probably a player that I forgot mentioning early on in this. He was also a big part of the core in MYM. So it was Mania and it was Hani as well. Funny story about Hani was that when we picked him up, we actually picked up a player called Levent, because he was very talented. But Hani and Levent were really good friends, and Hani was 15 at the time or something. And he would bother me for a month on end of giving him a chance. He would just be the 6th player, the reserve player. He just wanted to try out. And he had this, you know, at the time he had a very whiny voice because he was a kid. You know, he was a child going into his teens, and he was obnoxious. So I was like, whatever, I'll give you a shot. And I put him in on the mid lane in some game because he insists on it. He had like this very stubborn approach to the game in which he always thought that what he thought was the best thing to do, but it was in a charming way, you know. So you couldn't help but love him. So we gave him a shot. He played a Viper mid. It had never been seen before, and he stormed the enemy, curb stormed him completely, you know. And I was like, okay, we can try this again. Let's see if that continues to happen. And he continued doing so. And he just quickly became one of the best players that Dota 1 had ever seen. He also made a change to Heroes of Newerth, was probably considered one of the best players at that game as well. And so it needs to be said that he was essentially just as big a part of MYM as Mania and myself was. Sorry, throughout this I felt embarrassed for almost excluding him.
Sorry, there's a lot of people.
There's a lot of people.
So many people, a long time. At the end of a Dota 1, who would you consider like the best player you ever played with? Who stands out? Is there a clear name? But you can use any criteria you want. It doesn't have to just be a carry or something. You know, it's up to you who you'd pick.
It's It has to be, you know, a mix of the MYM players. I think in terms of consistency, I think Fear by large and far was the best. I think in terms of innovation, I think Merlini was. And I think in terms of raw skill, if it had been harnessed better, I think Hani was. So I think, one of those three players to me was the best. When I look back as well, though, it needs to be said, I think Kuroky, when you look objectively at how he played the game and how good he was, I think he's probably also a huge standout.
So when Dota 2 began and you were playing for Evil Geniuses, I mean, slightly after, obviously, in theory, MYM still for international. But when Evil Geniuses comes around and you're playing for this organization, this was a very bizarre period, because on the one hand, you go back and look at the names you had back then. There's some pretty good names in there, but unfortunately, a lot of them kind of like made good later. They kind of overcame the problems they had in EG and found better lineups later. So in the early days of Dota 2, some results were looking good, but then people just remember that this is a team that underwhelmed. Like, they think of some of the players, they think of some of the teams, and there were a lot of tough times seemingly in this lineup, right?
Yeah, there definitely was. I think, a huge part of the problem was definitely myself. So what happened was, after TI won, some of the players from MYM had the offer to go to China and play Misery, Playmate, stuff like that. And I really wanted to spend some time with my girlfriend and my studies again. Again, this trails back to how, if you want to do well in esport, you need to assert yourself 100% and you need to be motivated. Otherwise, you will not succeed. And that's sort of what happened with me, I think. I took a break, for like a 6-month break after TI1. I negotiated the new deal of them, some of my players joining Evil Geniuses, Misery, Playmate, Demon. They joined Evil Geniuses. I then joined up with them in January of 2012. After having a huge fight on Skype with Alex Garfield. This was my first encounter with the man, where we basically, flamed each other for an hour straight and called each other names and laughed at each other's pathetic excuses and really just had an argument. And everyone else was actually on Skype with us, some of the EG management, all of the players involved. So it was like an 8 or 9 person Skype call, but for an hour straight, the only one talking were Alex and myself. So we started off things by hating each other. But eventually he had to, so the team was very insistent that they needed me because they needed a captain that they could play under. And at the time, Fear Darkness didn't seem like that because Misery and Playmate wasn't satisfied. So they wanted me in. I joined the roster. And eventually, Playmate and Misery leave the team again for other reasons, and suddenly I'm left with essentially an all-American lineup and myself. And a big part of, when I look back, a big part of the reasons for why I wanted to play with Evil Geniuses was because of the paycheck. Because all of a sudden, here is a team that will actually justify me devoting all of my time to esport and Dota.
Sure.
And I could do it for a living. But this was the only offer I had to do so, unless I wanted to move to China, which was out of the question because I had a girlfriend that I liked a lot at the time. So essentially, what I was playing for was a paycheck, and this was a huge difference to why and how I approached Dota in Dota 1. Back then I did it for the passion of the game, first and foremost, and because I really, really loved playing with my teammates. That's not to say I didn't like playing with some of the teammates I had in Evil Geniuses, but I definitely did not have that same passion and love for the game and relationship to my teammates that I had with MYM. So I started. My skill level started declining in part because I think I just didn't care enough and I didn't put in the needed amount of hours. I was on teams with players like Fear Darkness and Universe who would all devote all of their awake time to owning their skills in regular public play if we weren't practicing. And I, on the other hand, would feel like I would rather flip burgers at McDonald's than show up for practice just because I was so fed up with the game. And even like through it all, I wouldn't realize that because today I'm very passionate about esport. I was back then as well. I just don't think I had the right mindset to have to be a player, but I didn't want to give up esport. And so I stuck around a lot longer than I should have. And I think I should have called quits a year sooner than I did. And a lot of the lineups that we had, probably I played a big part, if not the biggest part, of why those lineups failed. Because, when you have talent like Fear and Universe, who's proven TI winners, and you still can't make it work, that's obviously on someone.
Was there ever any element? I mean, some of these players you're referencing here, Fear, Universe, other people, Misery, etc. Some of them had tough beginnings to Dota. I mean, for someone like Misery, it took him a long time to really kind of turn the corner. But was there any element, since these are players coming from earlier versions of Dota, etc., was there a degree, was the game being a new game, any element of it? Did players come in with conceptions of how they could play from the old game and think, I'm going to be as good as I was, or it's, same hero anyway, who cares, Did people really have to kind of reset? Was it a similar game? Could you continue on?
It was a similar game, and you could definitely continue on. But that being said, and again, trading back to some of the things I said earlier, I had a very stubborn mindset. I was very arrogant. I came from probably being one of the undisputed kings of Dota 1. And suddenly I'm getting my ass handed to me in Dota 2. We did do well, sure, semi-decently well, but we never took any major titles. We didn't really do anything of notoriety. So essentially we failed, right? Because if you don't win, you lose. So by all means, we were a losing lineup. And I think a lot of this also stems back to me being very stubborn and arrogant in my approach to the game back then, and narrow-minded in how to do things. I think I really wanted to do things the way I'd gotten used to do them in Dota 1, and refused to change for the game or the teammates around me. I wouldn't be versatile enough or flexible, dynamic enough to actually accustom myself to new surroundings, basically. So I was so stuck in my ways of how I wanted to run things the way I did in Dota 1, but I didn't have the same players anymore. Yet and when I realized that, or when I failed to realize that, I still didn't do anything to change that. My solution to that was simply playless, careless, and that's what that at that point in time, everything was already over for me, right? I didn't have the drive to do the game. I just didn't want to realize it myself. I would blame teammates and blame it on all kinds of surroundings and everything, instead of just realizing that essentially the biggest problem was just with my attitude. So yeah.
So in that EG team, as your career was kind of, the playing part was winding down, one of the teams you got to face off against in the international was the Invictus Gaming team that went on to win the title. And famously, this is kind of when Ferrari 430 was in his prime, Since you got to play against that team, what made them so good at that point in time? Why do you think they were able to capture that TI?
Individually, I think all of them were some of the best players on their roles in the world. Ferrari, obviously the best mid laner of that tournament, completely demolished all opposition in the mid lane. I think YYF was a tremendously gifted player. I was sad to see him actually retire, but I can understand why when you pull in a million Chinese viewers for streaming. And then Chuan as well, I think he was the first of the position 4 players that really, really stood out to me as hugely talented. A lot of players have since come on that role and been very, very breakout and dominant. Jerex from OG, Crit, Psy, both of them on EG, and players like that, But I think Chuan was the first one to really, really assert himself as a game-changing 4-position player. And then with the strategic mind of Faith, who was miles ahead of everyone else in how to approach the game. I think they just had all the right cards in the deck to really outplay any other opposition. And what we had going for us in EG when we almost beat them, and it needs to be said, we did actually almost beat them. We had momentum and crowd going for us. We really played into the American crowd. It was in Benaroya Hall. Everyone was rooting for us because we were the American horse in the race. And we ran on the emotions, basically. And then it was also just destined to fail, just because as soon as we'd slip up big time, and that's what happened in game 3. Essentially, the pressure and the lack of foresight sort of got to us, and we did some dumb things. Instead of pressuring lanes in the early game, I would run around and try and jungle with a less rack and completely fail and didn't get anything out of it, meaning that we lost a lane while I was being under-leveled. And then Fear would TP in with the most farmed Morphling in all time, and he would TP in and die instantly and revive and do the same thing again. And then Demon on the Bounty Hunter would run around with Bounty Hunter, but he would constantly give up track to Rubik, which essentially made his hero useless, because he would now be tracked himself, so he couldn't go in this, and he would give a lot of gold and teamfight control over to them, because they would be able to track us at all times. So there was all these different parts of why that game 3 was a disaster. But we came off a game 2 where I think we won in 22 minutes, 20-2 was the score, and we did like 5-man Ravagers and 2 5-man Black Holes, and we made IG look complete trash. So we had a lot of confidence going into the match, but we lost our train of thought, and we lost our mental preparation.
Whenever I get talked to old school players from the games I was mostly in, like mainly CS, Quake to some degree, whenever the ones that are from like essentially the 2000s and especially the first half of the 2000s, whenever any of them talk to me now, the ones that haven't kept up with gaming are always like, oh fuck, I wish it had been like this in my day. Or some of them even will be like, like some of the ones who were like fantastically good, and just quit because they just felt like quitting, because that's what people used to do back in the day. It wasn't a career, obviously. Some of them are just like, fuck, I should have just kept playing, if I'd have been one of the best now, I'd be a superstar, I'd have all this money, people would love me. Since you actually, in theory, had the chance to do this, like you were one of the kings of Dota, like you said, when it was the smaller game, it was the grassroots game, it was the underground game, and then Dota 2 came along, and year on year on year, the game's growing, getting bigger, you're getting huge teams coming in, sponsorship, the prize money's going up. Is there a part of you is kind of wistful, is like, I was the best at the game where you could make fuck all money and it wasn't even a big esports game, like, CS players probably didn't know who you were, and I could have been maybe a star in Dota 2 where, everything, I would have gotten all the rewards, as it were. Is there a part of you wishes you could have stuck around a couple more years or could have gone 100% at the end for a year or two?
Oh yeah, huge part. Like, I'd be lying if I said whenever I go to TI, this year included, I don't feel jealous of the people going on stage, It's not so much it's not even the monetary value that I'm like missing out on. It's not that I feel like, oh man, I could be a millionaire now if I had just stuck around. I could be an undisputed king. I could be the Sumail or the Fear or the Kuroky. It's not that. It's really the ability to compete still. Go on that stage, sit in that box, and sit alongside my teammates, and experiencing the hype and the successes. Obviously, also the lows, because it's a part of it. But getting those emotions and getting the chance to compete is what I really miss. But then again, I also look at it, try to look at it objectively, and at the same time have that self-realization that nothing would have changed. I am who I am, and I was who I was, and my mindset just wasn't there. Like, I wasn't willing to give up my relationships with like, I have a tendency to find women who take up a lot of time and space and energy. Like, that's just my MO in my love life. Like,
okay.
Luckily my girlfriend is out getting food right now, but that's, historically, when I look at my relationships, I always take these women who requires a lot. And there's no room for full-time esport and these relationships. And at no point in time have I been willing to give up those relationships when I'm in them. In hindsight, afterwards, I'm always like, oh God, I wish I hadn't been in this relationship so I could have just asserted myself in the game. Obviously, looking back, I would have preferred doing that. But then again, I wouldn't be who I am today, and I wouldn't have learned the things I have. So, realistically speaking, I don't think I've missed out on anything, but the dreamer in me would have loved to continuing to compete and try it again, definitely.
When you were talking earlier about like your philosophy of the game, like a way to rephrase it almost would be that you you tried to make players feel comfortable. Like, here's the heroes I know you love to play. Oh, these are the ones that are good, but I'm going to give you this one because you like to play that. And that's like, obviously, it's a very good way to motivate someone. I mean, the old adage is that's like the carrot. You lead them. Oh, I want that, so I'm going to go towards it. In the modern era, I don't know if this is just because there's so many of the like carry role type players are young stars, where they're very brash and they think they're the best and all the rest of it. But I've noticed many of the strong in-game leaders in the modern era tend to be more along the line of the Dictator guy. It's more the stick end of the equation, I mean, since we're talking about Evil Geniuses and you had Fear and you had Universe, obviously the most famous captain of Evil Geniuses is PPD. And I know let's just say from sources that, like, some people at times might think he's an asshole, or some of his teammates might be like, I'm not a huge fan of the way this is going, but as long as you're winning, they're not going to question it as much, and people will accept a lot more. If you kind of expect a high standard of them, but you all accomplish it together, they'll go with that. Do you think a captain has to have kind of like a very dominant personality? Can you get away in the modern era, do you think, with being a little more soft touch?
No, I do believe that you have to have a very, very dominant personality. I think there's different ways of having that personality, though. There's the dictators, obviously, and then there's and this is something I've told, so before you think, oh, this guy is so full of himself, this is just something I've been told by teammates and friends and so forth. But then there's the charismatic guys that just likes to surround themselves with, players that they like and who like them. I think I'm the latter, and I think there's definitely captains who are the former, in which there are these dictator types that, you play this, play these strategies, this is what you got to do, la 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 la. And as long as you're winning, that is always working, because people love winning, and they will, as long as you're winning, they will be happy, because that's the best feeling ever. Sure. But as soon as that fails, that's when teams break up. Yes. You'll never respect a captain who's the only voice of the team but isn't making you win games. So that's why I don't like the dictatorship. I will always, sort of push it out and gone with the, hey, even when we're losing, we're still friends, right?
Yeah.
So that was basically my approach, I think. But I think there's also captains who make that work. I think without knowing so, because I haven't played with him myself, I think Fly is one of those captains. If you look at OG's playstyle, they seem to pick heroes that the players want to play. They seem to be this very knit-tight group of friends with, it's always, when esports teams talk about, we're a family and such, it's, that sucks for me to listen to. It's nothing is like that, because everyone will stab themselves, each other in the back as soon as things aren't working out. But I think in OG's case, I actually think there's, it's the closest thing you're going to come to a lineup where that holds true. Obviously Fly and No Tail are two of the most they're conjoined twins basically, except one is a Greek god and the other is just a regular Joe. But I think OG is a team that has that approach. I think the latest inception of Evil Geniuses is sort of the same thing as well. When I look at their playstyle and their strategies, I think this is a team that picks around what the players want to play. And most often it comes up with having these sort of greedy lineups, because everyone wants to play something that gets some degree of farm and has some sort of relevance. No one wants to be a full-out bitch. And I don't think, famously, people like to make fun of the Winter Wyvern put on by Crit, but it's not that he's not a good player and couldn't make it work. I just think he didn't play to his own strengths. He didn't pick to his own strength, and when he didn't sacrifice himself, this was the result of it. So obviously it was just not a very good pick in the whole strategic composition of the lineup they met and the lineup they had. But irregardless, this was a team from an outside perspective that seemed to always pick what the players want to play, much more so than the strategy that they built up beforehand.
Sure. So someone we referenced who you played with was another Danish player's Misery, and he's someone where, like, as I alluded to, despite the fact, I mean, he's not a young guy. It's not like he's 20 now and he's just broken out. He's been playing a long time, and in Dota 2 especially, it wasn't really until we're talking like 2 years ago, sort of, he started to have his big successes, and obviously last year culminating with making the final of the International. How do you describe this guy? Do you have any insight as to some of his issues? What took him so long where he kind of got his chance to shine?
Again, this trails back to when I talked about how, when you first asked about Loda, a lot of these players in Dota has had a decade to grow as players and as persons. Misery was one of the most hot-headed, ill-tempered, arrogant people that I have ever played with when I played with him when he was 18, 20 years old. Misery nowadays, the 2017 Misery is one of the most mellow, calm people that I have ever met. These two people are not at all the same. There's still this fiery spark within him that you could see when he was 18, and you can see now when he's 25, right? I don't actually know how old Rasmus is.
26 now.
26 now, okay. So the fire is still there. You can see when you see the pictures of how he played in the grand finals of TI6. Him with blood in his entire face, yelling, not raging, but having this beastly warrior attitude. So the fire is still there, but he's much more calm and collected about it now. He's much easier to work with and around, and to me, he's one of the people that I know in esports who's come the longest, matured the most. But that's also because I knew Rasmus very intensely back then, and I know him really well now. So I'm sure there's a lot of other players who did the same thing, had that same road of experience that led them to become better people, essentially. And that's I can see that in young players as of today, right? In all kinds of different games. I think Reckless from League of Legends is a player who's gonna be even better and bigger than he was 2 years ago, just because he has the right mindset and skill set, but he needs some sort of maturity on some levels. He needs to experience the world. He needs to come out of his shell and such. I think to allude to one of the players from North that were just benched and then transferred to Optic, I think Magisk Boy is a player that he's hugely intelligent and he's extremely talented, but he also needs some experience that only life can give him before he's really the best version of himself. So essentially what I'm alluding to in this regard is that, can I envision Magus being a part of North in 3 years? Yeah, I can, because in that amount of time, or in 5 years, whatever, in that amount of time, I think he'll mature a lot and develop a lot as a person to becoming a much better version of himself. And I think a lot of the young talent of today is going to be even better players when they get a few years under their cape.
I mean, that's the interesting thing, isn't it, when you're a captain, is that you get people where if you get your point of contact with them is, say, very early, either in their career or as a person, like they're young or they just only played a couple of years, the talent could already be there. They could already have basically like the skills where if you could sort of pilot their body, you could already win TI. They're already good enough. But that's the whole point. They don't have like the control. They don't have the model of how to play the game, or maybe they don't work with teammates very well. And sometimes there's certain players where I'll sometimes say in CS, like, oh, it's good that this guy got kicked from a better team and is now going to go to sort of like the second team in his country or region. Because if he can make it back, then he'll have gone through some sort of change. Either he'll learn how to play with teammates, or he'll learn, oh, actually, I thought I was a superstar of this team, but, this guy supporting me was pretty good, It's kind of one of the difficulties of being a captain, right? Because you can't make someone go through that process.
Yeah, it is. Like when you're a captain and when you're in an active lineup, you have to work with what's in front of you now. You can only work in the now. There's no, like in esports especially, you don't have that longevity. You don't have the time, in some of the American sports especially, you can build up a lineup and it's supposed to peak in a year from now or 2 years from now even. We had that in FC Copenhagen football as well. In 2011 or 2012, I think, they had a shit lineup. But then they built towards a championship team, and it culminated last year when they did decently well in Champions League, and then they won the Danish championship and the Danish trophy and all of that, and they did so 2 years running, right? So regular sports have that time and have that time frame to play under, whereas in esport, you better make it work within a month, otherwise we need to make changes again. That seems to be the gist of things, regardless of the title. So captains need to work with the player they have right now, and organizations do the same thing. Everyone can only work in the current month and the current year, nothing else. You can't have enough foresight and time to just wait it out. It doesn't matter how good of a player he is if he doesn't work with the lineup that you have right now. So that's a big problem. Oh, well, I don't know if it's a problem. It's just one of the cornerstones of how you have to build up a lineup that is successful. You need to make sure that they can do so in a short amount of time, and not like you don't have that long time frame to work with. That also means that sometimes players who could be good under the right circumstances just aren't. Yes. And some players who seem really good because they have the ideal circumstances are probably not very good in most other scenarios. Yes. So it's sort of in some sense, it's very random whether the people you put together functions or not, because whether you want it or not, especially in esport, because there's no title with more than 5 players on the roster. Overwatch with 6, but whatever. It's these knit-tight little rosters where you spend all your time together. You don't have a bench. You have no reserves. These 5 people need to make it work together, both on a social level and in game. And that's really, really hard to do. And one of the things now working in around the football world as well, it's something you have to make the regular sports world understand as well. You can't take the framework of regular sports and just assert it into esport, because it's not the same. There's definitely a lot of things that can be applied, but there's also things you need to respect, and that needs a different kind of approach. And I think team creation is one of them. Building the correct lineup is something that takes a lot more from the personal attitude of the player than it would, say, American football or European football. So along these lines, then, this is actually an aspect where I've always found it very interesting in the management side of esports, which is obviously something you've moved into now yourself with North and previously with Alliance, with Element, etc. But one aspect that I found interesting is, I understand why in interviews, if someone's in a smaller org, they'll always stress, like you're saying, like, oh, we're family, this guy, he's still developing, we want to give him a chance to, because ultimately they don't necessarily have the choice. They can't just go and get the best player or whatever, or they have to that's their lottery ticket. They're hoping this young guy develops in a year and then he is super good and then they've got him, But I've always been a little bit iffy personally when it goes to the top teams. Like for me, if you're the esports equivalent of Real Madrid, you probably should every year, if something isn't working, even with a very good player, you probably should chop and change and get a superstar player who right now can win you the championship that year. You're not building for 3 years from now. And so I wanted to ask, with the time you were in Evil Geniuses, from the outside, it looks like Alex Garfield is one of these owners who's on board with that idea. Like he is willing to say, okay, even if this guy was someone who's a beloved player, if we can get someone better, okay, I'm into that. If the team's into making this big move, this power move, he's done it across many titles. Was it that way with your relationship with him when you were in Evil Geniuses? He's a shrewd businessman, no doubt about it. But he's also, disclaimer, I think Alex is one of the most inspirational people I have ever worked with. So he's a bit of an eccentric. He's definitely a very unique character, but he's also his vision is really something. I truly miss him in esport because he's this shrewd businessman that he's cutthroat, right? He'll do what is needed for his teams and his business, but at the same time he's very loyal, like extremely loyal. I've never met any esports organization or owner in throughout time that has had the same kind of loyalty towards his people that Alex has had. When he had to fire Hydra, he still paid his rent for the rest of the year, despite the fact that the only one fucking up was Hydra himself. Hydra was being unreasonably unprofessional, and yes. Alex could no longer make excuses for him. But he had tried his hardest to make it work. People don't know this because it's not public information, and maybe I shouldn't even be talking about it. But Alex then went on to pay his rent for the rest of the year, regardless of it, and probably pay him a bit of a salary as well on the side, despite the fact that Hydra no longer had ties to Evil Geniuses. And I think that speaks volumes to, and this is how I've experienced Alex throughout our entire career. If you're if you truly were an Evil Geniuses person, like if you were a player that devoted yourself to the team and the brand, then you would receive that same kind of love back from Alex. And I think whichever of the Evil Geniuses franchise players you'll ask about this, they'll all, agree with me. Regardless of whether you ask the StarCraft division or the so he hasn't had that many divisions in later years after I joined, but also the Dota people that he's worked with, right? And the people behind the scenes. So while he definitely demands a winning lineup, he's also loyal to the people that he surrounds himself with because he chooses them for a reason.
So one of the interesting things is you obviously were already involved in some sense in management, but this is what I wanted to ask you about. So it seems like it was a slow transition. Like from the outside, Maelk, you just one day owned Alliance or something, right? And it's like, whoa, now he just owns a huge org, they've won TI, etc. But obviously there were other things going on here, which is that this is the era when Alex Garfield was so good at getting sponsors for teams. He was like, I could make 2 teams with sponsors. So he did. But then the problem is, as you'd expect, the pushback from the industry was like, you can't have 2 teams in the same games. Obviously, for things like League of Legends especially, you have to literally make it so they're not the same orgs. Like there was that whole bizarre scenario where they just marketed the team in America, which then became Evil Geniuses, but that was just a sponsorship issue. So from the outside, Maelk, it looked like he just said, all right, my old mate, you were in Evil Geniuses with me, you're involved with the org, I need someone to own, I'm doing like the air quotes here, I need someone to own Alliance. So I definitely, I just want to make clear here, I don't own Alliance anymore, you own it, Maelk. But, maybe one day if I ever needed it back, you'd be a pal and, I'd get it back. Was it anything along these lines? What was the situation here with becoming the owner of Alliance? Because obviously it eventually became something different. Was it kind of a weird situation at first? Did it come out of the blue?
No. I mean, what you're saying is definitely true. It's just not that black and white. It did so happen that Alex came using almost those exact words, right? Well, he didn't say, be a pal and give it back to me, if that is ever the case.
Sure, obviously. That was implied.
No, it wasn't even implied, actually. But so what happened is I managed the League of Legends squad of Evil Geniuses throughout 2013, I believe it was.
Yes. The one with Snoopy and Froggen and those guys, yeah.
Exactly. And so after Worlds, there would be this shuffle in which we suddenly had the opportunity to create 2 lineups. One around Krepo and Snoopy that would remain the Evil Geniuses lineup later to become Winterfox. Yes. And the other situated around Froggen, who was by all means the star of the show.
Yes.
And who wanted to remain in Europe. I was more or less the only person that Alex knew well enough to trust running any sort of European operation. So he asked me if I wanted to do this alongside Froggen, which I happily agreed to. And so Alex, kept running things with Snoopy and Krepo, and Froggen and I went off to do our thing with Alliance. And I think the ownership and how it was being run was very similar to what we see today with Refresh and Astralis and Heroic. So in the marketing side of things, it would still be Good Game Agency running things, and from a business perspective, it would for the most part also be Good Game Agency. Like I would, when sponsors were secured, I would then take over and talk to them directly, right? But the actual negotiation with sponsors and so forth would be Good Game Agency and Alex and the others from that. The management of Good Game. But the sporting side of things would entirely and exclusively be me. And once that these sponsors were locked in, it would also be me. And the business side of things would be me and so forth, like the finances. So it was a standalone company, but it's completely true that Good Game functioned as our marketing or handling company or whatever you want to call it. But in the day-to-day operations, there would be zero to no involvement from Alex. He wouldn't dictate what players would be a part of the team. He wouldn't dictate anything basically on the sporting side of things. So that was was a pretty good role for me because it played into the strengths that I have. And because it was a one-man company for almost the entire duration, I couldn't have carried or pulled off anything if I had to do this all on my own. So it was very, very important that Good Game remained that extended arm of Alliance. But there was no control or ownership for Alex. So by all means, from the get-go, before I was even the registered owner of Alliance, I already had the same control that I did a year after. Because, we ran that lineup when we won the summer split and everything with Froggen. We've already been running the company for a year, and then it so happened that Riot would dictate Alex cannot be the owner on paper.
Yes.
And essentially that's just, so in legal terms, there was a change, but in how the company was ran, there was little to no change. Then it so happened that the league would move to Berlin, so now I had a much, because I lived in Berlin. So my day-to-day operations with the team would increase, but that was only beneficial to us. It was a coincidence, but by all means, what I did before we did the change was the same as I did afterwards. Meaning in the sense that I had complete control throughout it. Like when we first created the Froggen lineup around Alliance, Froggen desperately wanted Edward.
Yes.
And
Freeze.
And Freeze, yeah. So
and that guy in the top lane who you couldn't get, I forget his name. He's like a Swedish guy, I think.
No, he's Danish actually.
Right.
Sorrow Zero.
Oh, right, him as well, okay.
But I had a meeting with Edward. I had my own impressions of Edward, and I told Froggen, we can definitely build most of this lineup, but you are not getting Edward. And he was like, I'm building this lineup and I'm getting Edward. So we already had our first falling out right off the bat, right? And I told him, there is no way you are getting Edward. It is not happening. And it didn't happen. And so, a lot of people think Froggen built the lineup on his own. And with all, in all fairness, he pretty much did, because he had the insight into the League of Legends scene.
Sure, yes.
I definitely did not. So for the most part, I would listen to everything he had to say, but I would, having a lot of experience myself and having been a captain and everything, I would still take meetings with the players and everything and get my own perception of who they are as people and players and look them up and do the homework and the background check. And Edward didn't flag as someone I wanted to work with. So regardless of what Froggen wanted, he was not getting that particular player. And that's sort of how we did it moving forward. Luckily, Froggen aligned himself with people that I, okayed and wanted to work with throughout time, so it wasn't a big problem.
So during the time that you were with this team, as you said, when you'd been with them when they were Evil Geniuses, right, this was the difficult period because that was where it was the year after they'd had their success. They'd been really good the year before when they'd been in CLG, and then in Evil Geniuses for that 1 year in Season 3, they were kind of like a middling team where they had little spikes towards the playoffs, and obviously Froggen particularly was very good still, but there was the feeling at the time that like that lineup had to kind of break up, some of the other players weren't as good, and they obviously weren't getting the same level of success they were accustomed to. And so if you have a superstar player, it's like with Arteezy in Dota, people, if he doesn't win, the question is always, where should he go? It's never like, oh, should we kick him from the team? No, you're going to build around the star player if you can. So when you came to the Alliance era, and the first split was very troubled, they actually started out with a very bad record. At the end, kind of picked it up, but then in the summer season, had this fantastic season. They actually, at the time, it was the most dominant European season we'd seen. They won the championship. As someone who isn't, as you say, intimately involved with League of Legends, you're from the world of Dota. In fact, at the same time, you were still involved with Dota. You started your casting career to some degree. Was it satisfying to get a team of your own as from a management position to a championship level?
Yeah, definitely. It was very satisfying, in fact. But it's also. It's sort of, so the team during that period was in Cologne and I was in Berlin. And it was very hard sort of dictating what they needed to do. And, I think a lot of League of Legends teams have had that same problem with how the living situation was. So they would be, pretty much handling themselves on a day-to-day basis, meaning they will also have these. The house would essentially be completely trashed. Regardless of whether we send cleaning out or not, it would take a few days, and then everything would be a complete disaster as well. It was. I to this day I still cannot understand how they lived under those circumstances, but they did, and it was their own fault. And then they moved to Berlin, and we started tinkering more with things, and we took in Reckless to the lineup instead of Tabs. At the time, it seemed like we created the super lineup because we just came off a win in the summer split, and Reckless was obviously the star player of the entire European LCS. But this also traces back to how even if you have all the individual pieces of the puzzle, it doesn't mean that they're from the same puzzle, right? It doesn't mean that together they'll add up to this perfect picture. And that was the case of Alliance. We had a lineup that had learned to live and love each other, despite everyone's flaws and mistakes. And then we add this new guy who also comes with all his own expectations to the team, and from an outside perspective, the grass was greener for him, and from our perspective, the grass was greener. And then a whole new level of problems arise, and as we're trying to put out fires because we're losing so much, all the old problems sort of comes up to the surface, and this star-studded roster that by all means should be winning just can't make it work together. And it doesn't matter how much time you spend talking it out, or if you use psychologists or anything, like nothing will change their mindset and how they perceive each other. You've already burned the bridge, you're way past it, and you can't go back. And that was the problem with that lineup. They might have all had the skill individually, but they couldn't make it work together because outside of the game, they more or less hated each other. And inside of the game, there was no trust because of it. One guy had this one way of perceiving how to play the game, the other guy had this one, and at some point in time, you just played to make yourself look good, and so forth. And when people start doing that, the Alliance of 2015 happens.
So, since the team had won the summer season in Season 4, 2014, and then in Season 5, this is when it became Elements, but essentially it's the same squad. And as you say, you've done the blockbuster trade. It's actually one of the biggest trades in the Western League of Legends history. Getting a player from another championship-level team, a Fnatic, to come over, especially their young star, in theory, that's supposed to be the future of the squad. Obviously, he has since gone back there. And not only did it not work very well, but during the split, you were even doing emergency transfers, bringing Crepo, quick help, trying to do things to fix things. And since, as you say correctly, these were champions of this previous split, many of these players were thought to be very good at their positions. The initial thing that people do when you have good players that's not working is they say, right, what's everything else that's fucked here, right? So obviously, famously, a thing in Alliance was the coaching situation. People were like, oh, well, that's changed. How is that going? Is it the coach is not the right guy bringing it all together? And then you yourself actually came onto some fire, because I will set the context that since you literally at that time are not just from Dota, you're still in Dota, you're even analysing at Dota events. People already, understandably, in the League of Legends community, if you know what that subreddit's like, have a level of antipathy towards people who are from Dota. But I remember that one of the main things they did was they said, right, well, let's look at the timeline, right? This guy's doing Dota events while the team's playing. Now, they didn't actually, by the way, acknowledge that you were actually at the International while they won the summer split. So there's up and down to that. Was it strained trying to manage this, as you say, like a sort of rockstar nightmare situation where you've got all these star players and different ways to think of the game at the same time as having a career as a Dota caster and analyst? Was there difficulty there? Does that play any role in it, do you think?
It definitely takes its toll, and you could definitely make a case for why I should have, or the team rather could have deserved my undivided attention rather than me also focusing on other parts of my career. That's definitely fair criticism. But I think a lot of them, from a community perception, they also are very quick to, and that's something I've noticed in League of Legends, right? That's not something we've known from neither Dota or not even Counter-Strike much.
Yeah.
it's a community that is very quick to put all blame on coaches and management. And I think sure enough, we had Jordan coach at one point. We won the summer split with him as a coach, but by all means, I don't think he was the perfect coach for that team. And I think if you ask the team themselves, they don't think so either. So Jordan was put on leave immediately after Worlds because it wasn't a working relationship that we were looking for. We bring in Pusher Street, a guy who's actually followed League of Legends, knows it decently well. Sure enough, doesn't have the same high level of understanding as the players do, but most coaches do not. There's not,
especially at that time.
Especially at that time, there was probably only Prolly and, as the split progressed, Young Buck. Outside of that, I don't think a lot of the coaches understood League the same way the players did, and for good reason, because it was a very new game, and some of the best coaches of any sport haven't necessarily been players. Sure enough, there's plenty of cases of where they have, but not. You don't need to having been a successful player of the title to actually be a good coach. And part of that logic was something I applied to Martin. And I think if you ask the players in hindsight, a lot of them, sure enough, there would be players who did not get along or didn't think he did anything of notable change. But there'll also be players who really say, well, at least Martin did as much as he could with what we allowed and how we tried to make it work. And so it's, I'm not trying to at all say management wasn't to blame or coaches wasn't to blame. Definitely plays a big part of it. But, you can't make diamonds from coal unless you have the tools to do so. And these players wouldn't give us the tools to do so. I don't think any psychologist in the world could have fixed that team.
As referenced, since at the same time as being involved with Evil Geniuses as the European League of Legends squad, then Alliance, then Elements, since at the same time you were doing the Dota events as well on desks and being a part of the broadcast team, in theory, you've never gotten to go fully all in on that side of Dota 2 either. You've never had just a totally clean slate to be like, right, I'm going to do whatever. I mean, I think one year in CS I did like 17 events or something, something mental like that. Is that like, has it been good for you to just do some events? Is there a part of you ever wonders, what if I could have just gone all in on that? What would that path have been like if I'd have gone down it?
Not really. I mean, I think one thing I've learned as I've grown older is the ability to judge my own shortcomings. And one of the big shortcomings I have is that, first of all, my level of English. I know there's plenty of cases for why that shouldn't apply. We have YNK in Counter-Strike who does a great job. There's people in Dota as well, interchangeably. But if you notice, the Dota scene predominantly have people whose has English as their first language, or you have Sundarin who's studied English, has a master's degree in English, and has no noticeable accent, whereas I have one of the most noticeable Danish accents of all time. Like, it sounds like I have a potato lodged in my throat at any given time. And whether or not that bothers people, it's something that I have a hard time, justifying as being prime talent because of that. And at the same time, I also rub people the wrong way. There's a guy like Malini who has he just has this natural ability,
charisma, right?
And natural charisma, exactly, where people love him, whereas I'm much more of a easy to hate kind of guy, a lot because of my attitude. People joke about me being the heel on Dota broadcast, and sure enough, I was hired to be the heel on a lot of these broadcasts. The ESL ones in particular, my job description would literally be the heel. And I don't know, I think if I'd done a ton of events like that, I would have just gotten tired of it. If I had to put up with everyone constantly making fun of my resemblance to Reek, or a Venomancer game in a career of 1,000 games where I have one game that is 0-20, or just these kinds of things, or how big of an asshole I am. If I had to listen to that day in, day out for 52 weeks a year, yeah, I'd get tired of it. So like, I love doing it when it's in a small vacuum. I think it's hilarious. I think it's fun. I get to do it with my friends. I'm friends with all the Dota talent. As long as I love doing it, I think it's great doing. But I think if it was my everyday job, I'd hate it. So it's never really been on the table for me to do so. So no, I don't regret not being able to fully focus on a analyst or caster career. I wouldn't work as a caster again because of aforementioned accent or dialect. And as an analyst, I think I think my role would quickly be irrelevant if I was on every panel.
So when I talk about this period with North, where you're the sporting director, and this is a team, esports team created, connected to a very famous Danish football team, people are going to think this is like, I'm in on like the PR payroll here. But one of the things that's actually very significant about the creation of this team is, forget the football side of things, Denmark has not actually had many esports organizations. It might sound bizarre because if you go look at the players doing well in championships and in Counter-Strike particularly, you'll see a lot of Danish talent there. People will naively think things like, oh, MTW, wasn't that a Danish org? No, it was a German org from many years before, from like Quake or something, you know. So one of the bizarre things is that there haven't really been these orgs coming from Denmark, and despite all the success so how did this come about? Why is there now, in theory, a big sports team making an org within Denmark? What was the impetus, and why are you involved?
So I think FC Copenhagen in particular, they received a ton of requests for, are you entering esport? Have you seen these different football clubs? Not just from the general public, like the general public to a very, very large degree kept doing that. And a lot of these LinkedIn glory hunters as well, they kept approaching the management of FC Copenhagen, the so self-proclaimed esports experts, people you and I have never heard of.
Sure, yes.
And they got a lot of these to the degree where they're like, what is this esports thing? And then they started hearing about it from other places, sponsors or partners and the media and everything. And so they started looking into it. And they actually spent, from what I'm told, 8 months of investigating, putting 2 guys on it. They had their everyday dealings with their responsibilities. And then outside of that, they also tried to understand and grasp what this esports phenomenon was. So they did that for 8 months. And then it so happened that at TI6, I was there to find and recruit a Dota lineup for Schalke 04. Which was famously the football club from Germany that I sold elements to.
Yes.
And so when I was at TI, which was all planned, and I was there for a reason. I needed to pick up a Dota team for Schalke. The League of Legends team failed miserably and got eliminated from the LCS. And a part of my contract and a part of the buyout was that a bit of my, a substantial amount of my payment would come through my salary, but only for as long as we were in the LCS. So whether or not Schalke liked working with me and whether or not they thought I was competent at my job, as soon as, it makes perfect sense from a business perspective, as soon as you can, get rid of that hefty of a salary, you'll probably do it. Because without, disclosing the actual figure, and mind you, this was because it was a part of my buyout sum.
Yes.
My salary was an obscene amount of money. And you couldn't justify anyone in the world in esports having that position to that amount of money as a business if you could get rid of the person.
Yes.
So sure enough, I was fired the same day. Whether or not that had anything to do with my doings as a manager, I don't know. There's definitely probably a bit of column A and column B.
Even if you knew that part there, that realistically, almost anyone who's got business sense will probably do this, Yeah. I mean, for example, just to play devil's advocate, even if you wanted the person still, you'd probably fire them in that scenario, then rehire them at a different, renegotiate, Even though you knew this is business and there's other opportunity, did it sting when they fired you?
Yeah, it did. It definitely did. I had some great colleagues. They were great to work with, and I liked a lot of the ideas and the vision they had for esports. You can see since then it's definitely stagnated. I think a big part of that is because they don't have anyone who really understands or knows esports. They didn't rehire my role. They didn't replace me.
Yeah.
They simply just let me go. And I think that's a shame because they came in with the right motivation and the right drive and the right ideas, and then they somewhere along the way changed the outlook of what they wanted to do. They scaled back, which I think is a shame. Or they rediversed the investment into creating other things. I'm not entirely sure what goes on in Schalke right now, but I know that for their League of Legends part, they're investing heavily into that, but only that, and then to some FIFA. And I think that's a shame because they definitely had the potential to be a multi-game organization that could topple some of the best if they wanted to. And maybe they will down the line. But right now they're just focusing on those two titles, and that's fine. That's their decision. But at the time it definitely stung because it wasn't something that was even alluded to my face that if this happens, and I knew it was in writing, but I'd forgotten about it, and because everything was going so well outside of the results, but from a management perspective and the structure that we're starting to build up and all the visions we had for the company, I did not see it coming. I just did not. And when I was fired, instead of entering a dialogue with them, which they offered, I completely shunned them, didn't respond to them, and let my lawyers do all the dealings with them from there on out. So whether or not there would have been a job offer to a different, payment level, I never ever gave them the chance to even talk to me about it. So that's that. And then going back to the actual thing, we were North, exactly. So it so happened that I came back from the international after having just been let go from Schalke, and FC Copenhagen reached out and asked if I wanted to come talk to them, consult for them, actually. And I agreed, but I also came in with, the wrath of a scorned woman, and sort of was very skeptical about football clubs all of a sudden, obviously. And so we had a 2-hour-long initial meeting, 2 or 3 hours long, and I was just being an ass throughout it, like an arrogant guy that would not, I told them everything on my mind, basically. This wasn't a job interview for me. It wasn't me trying to be the best version of myself. It wasn't me trying to alter their perception of who I was. I was just giving them the raw, unfiltered version of all my truths, basically. And surprisingly enough, they apparently liked that. So they kept asking me to come back and talk to them about their options in esports and which people and which games to enter and everything. And I started doing some deeper level consulting for them. And eventually a few months passed by, and we had very, very similar visions because they, as I mentioned earlier, they'd done their homework. And so they wanted to do Counter-Strike first and foremost, and they wanted to do Dota2 secondly. They didn't want to do League of Legends because of this and that and that. And so we had very, very similar outlook on what the best kind of way to build an esport brand would be. And eventually they said, okay, we have all these different applicants or people that we could hire for it. What do you think of this guy? What do you think of this guy? So I definitely I gave them, again, my brash opinion of people. Some were good, some were bad. And they took it into heart. And then eventually, they played their cards out. I knew this was coming, but then they asked me if I wanted to be a part of it and spearhead the project. And I agreed because even though I was mindful about how I had a good relationship to the people in Schalke until I didn't, it also seemed like I even had an even deeper professional bond already to these guys, and they seemed very genuine, and they seemed very upfront about what they liked and what they didn't like. A very brash Danish attitude. And so it seemed like a match made in heaven, I think. And yeah, then I joined North and we did Counter-Strike.
So that's actually something I wanted to ask about, which is, like, this might be it. Who knows? This might be a tricky question. I don't want to get you in any trouble here. So bearing in mind, in the future, if anything changes radically, people might link back to this and be like, oh, what about when you said that there? But one of the big problems I've always had, a big skepticism I have, the second I hear that any sports team, actually, by the way, it's not just football, but obviously in Europe it's football. As soon as they get involved, you've seen all these stories. I'm sure you've laughed at them as well. What will always happen is the story, it's like your brain can only take in part of the story at a time. You see the first part, it's like big sports team looking to get involved. Your brain's like, ooh, interesting, right? Obviously they're big, they've got a lot of money. You're processing like, what would that mean if they got into the game I liked? Then you filter down the article and we're all waiting for that line where it says like, and they'll be starting with a FIFA team next, and you're like, forget about it then, right? We'll just go on to the next one, wait till someone else comes in. In America, the other example they do is, it'll be like, oh, the NHL wants to get into esports. You're like, oh, cool. By doing NHL 2K, you're like, oh, fuck, they've done it again. Like, guys, these aren't big esports games, like, I realize to you think to yourself, I get their perspective. Wait a minute, we do football, we do hockey, the game's about hockey, some people play the game, which is a hockey game. That's got to be our logical starting point. With North, you're saying here, like, they initially didn't have that impetus. What do you think of that in general? Like this approach that for some reason these sports teams all want to just go into their sport, and they haven't figured out the disconnect that part of esports actually is about things that aren't real in a way. It's like Quake where you run around with a lightning gun, or it's obviously Dota's nothing like real life. Why do you think the disconnect exists?
I think for all the clubs who do that, I think it's just a marketing tool, right? It's the difference between projects such as North and all the others essentially, because with all the European football clubs who goes into esport, right? Either they've been receiving the wrong kind of consultancy, and they genuinely believe that this is what they need to do in esport. I doubt that though, or they do it as a marketing tool, a way to cater to their younger audience and get that 25% of the male population who really likes computer games. It's a cheap, efficient way of doing that. It's the cheapest kind of marketing they can possibly get, because some of these teams probably don't even play their FIFA players much of anything because it's FIFA. So it's a very, very an easy investment for them to make. It might not even be, the club president might not even be involved. He might not even know they have an esport division. Yeah. And that's vastly different from that of North and what I understand other team owners will also do. Like when you can see the investment, right? The level of commitment, most notably in North America with some of the different organizations where they actually invest into esport. They do their homework. They go in and invest into the Team Liquids and the Immortals and so forth, and they want to be a part of esport. It's not a marketing tool. And that's what I really hate about these European football clubs who all come in and they write esport with a capital S and they announce their FIFA player, and, no one bats an eye, because nowadays it's just become, this again. 2 years ago, it was pretty cool because, these football clubs are, opening their eyes to esport, and you hope that they'll follow up FIFA with a different title, and none of them ever do. And that to me is, it's sort of disheartening, but also tells the true color of these football clubs and what they actually want to do. Because the more of them we hear, the more I myself start to think of the club. Okay, well, you're doing it for the marketing. So in North's case and the others, I imagine there was a clear-cut vision of why we wanted to do it, right? So whether they want to admit it on the highest level or not, club president and everything, they firmly believe esport is going to outgrow football and regular sports at some point. Otherwise, they would not invest into it, or at least be similar levels to it, right? They firmly believe that this is the future, and if you want to get in, you got to get in now. Because what happens when everyone else, if this actually is the future, what happens when everyone realizes that this is the future? Then all the other football clubs will do it the right way. The Barcelonas, the Real Madrids, the Manchester Uniteds, the Arsenals and the Bayern Munichs, they will also invest into it. The difference being that those clubs have vastly bigger budgets than that of, for instance, FC Copenhagen.
Yes.
But if we do it the right way and we do it from the beginning, and we can still be in the money ball game, we can become the Barcelonas and the Bayern Munichs of esport before they even think about entering. We can get that firm grasp of esport. That's a hope. So the ones we align, or like the ones we strive to become, they're not Barcelona and Bayern Munich. They are in their size in football, right? But what we want to be in esport is we want to be the highest competing brands with the likes of Liquid and Fnatic. These are the guys that we're striving to be.
Yeah.
So they, it's business, so they do it for those reasons. But at least it's the right reasons from an esports business perspective, is how I perceive it.
So this is also another tricky question because it's about investment and it's about the future of where things go. So one of the things people know is that as soon as North got this Counter-Strike team, we saw in all the interviews they're receiving one of the highest salaries. This is one of the points that was hit pretty heavily, and people know that the salary is incredibly high. Now this is where it's tricky, okay, because there's some people who look at, like, if you come from where we came from, but you and I, when we first started in esports, it looks amazing just what the scene is now. Like, there's a part of us could just be like, hey, this is cool, let's just see how this goes, and enjoy it for what it is. And there was a certain type of esports businessman who was fantastic within esports, but he was a businessman. So he's like, right, well, yeah, I'm going to do amazingly, I'm going to make money back, I'm going to make a profit, and cool, let's keep the scene as it is now, where I'm kind of at the top. And we're talking about, by the way, some people who are some of the best of all time. They're amazing at running their teams. But these people, there's a reason why there aren't North American teams that get paid salary that North does. It wouldn't matter if the players were as good. It's not just that they can get the players cheaper and so they pay them less. Some of those businessmen would tell you, well, why would I invest that money now? It would basically be running at a loss. I'm putting money in and I'm not going to get it out, and I'm gambling on the future. So if you look in the other esports games, you look at, obviously, Overwatch is a prime example, but League of Legends is a very good one because it had a different models it went through, and now we're arriving with both games at a franchise model where the whole point of why teams want to enter into a franchise ultimately is they hope one day that's where the team will make its millions. They'll make millions and billions because we'll have TV deals, and they'll have a trickle down because they're a franchise and they share in the profits of the league. Now, the problem is, that doesn't exist in CS at the moment. And currently, there's not even a hint of that. There's no one has got at the moment like one big league or something where you're a franchised member. Maybe we've got the initial steps with the WISA and PEA. People are kind of trying to build that bridge one step at a time. But people would say from the outside, isn't this doing such a big investment in CS right now, which can't really make back the money? It can't make the revenue at this point. Isn't that a big gamble if CS in the next few years doesn't go down something akin to a franchise model or some kind of a big league thing where a team like North will directly benefit from the league? Isn't that somehow tied into the premise?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, for our part, what we hope to mimic is definitely that there's some kind of structure in place that mimics that of European football, right? So that the TV rights become the reason for why these teams exist. Right now, yeah, everyone is running at a loss. There's no esports team who does not. That's why all of them are getting investment, right? So there's no esports team is different right now. No one is making money. The only people in esports who's making money right now are the players. Players make a ton of money in comparison to what they used to. So they keep prize money. They get high salaries. They have little to no obligations, and other than playing the game. And yeah. They basically make all the money, and that is, it is just a gamble essentially. But it also shows, I think it's a healthy sign of where people really, really firmly believe esports is gonna go. I had this in Schalke, and I have this in FC Copenhagen as well. The people here at a top level, all of them, they have a genuine interest for esport. They like watching the games. They like the action it provides. Some of them watch more Counter-Strike than they watch football, simply because it's a very digestible product that is fun, entertaining to watch, and it's once they learn the ways of it. And Counter-Strike is good in that regard because it's fairly easy to grasp in comparison to that of Dota2 or League of Legends. So once they get the hang of the basics of the game, they start appreciating it, and there's different ways of appreciating Counter-Strike because everyone can appreciate someone shooting the other guy in the head, But then there's also the next levels of appreciating the strategies and the grenade trajectories and all of these things, right? And the timings and all of these things. So it appeals to a viewership on different levels, but the basic level is still entertaining enough for outsiders, which I like to call them, people with no computer game background, to still watch. And because of that, because they can see themselves watching it, because they themselves have the drive to watch it that isn't affiliated to the business aspect of it, that gives them the belief that esport is going to be what they hope and believe it will be. And that's why the investment is justifiable, because by all means it does look as if this will become the next big thing, but it will also remain the next big thing. So right now there's this arms race to become these different relevant teams, regardless of what laws you're running at. But I think much more so, it's important for all the clubs to work together towards creating these the framework for how the clubs can make money. Esports has this tendency, and I know this myself because this is how I grew up with the teams, right? All the team owners are shady businessmen who will do everything to fuck over the players.
Yeah.
If you look at esports right now, that's not the case. The players are screwing the esports organizations real hard. They bent them over, they went in without loop, and they're just giving it their all. On 5 different doses of Viagra. That's the players right now. Really, really just putting it to the organizations. Whenever orgs are negotiating with players right now, they're just being bitch slapped. Every organization owner will tell you this. They have little to no leverage because they are negotiating against each other, and the players are just pushing the salaries like this. So in order for esports to actually be a healthy environment where everyone benefits, everyone benefits in sports. You don't hear Ronaldo ever complaining about his salary, and if he does, he should shut up. And you don't hear Barcelona or Bayern Munich complaining about their financial status, and you don't hear the TV networks complaining about the pricing on how much they pay or anything. That is where we need to go. We need for it to be a sustainable, healthy environment for everyone involved, and for that to happen, the fan attention needs to go mainstream, so that the amounts that we will get from YouTube or Facebook or regular TV networks and whatnot will increase, and that sum of money then needs to be divided into the clubs, and the clubs then need to divide those, their finances onto the players, so that everyone is happy and we have a sustainable cycle of income that works for everyone involved, not just one. Because what happens if the clubs continue to operate at a loss and have to bow out? Esports breaks down as a whole, because no one's there to pay the players anymore. No one's there to push the players promotionally. No one is there to build up storylines and create the hype around esport. The leagues will disappear because there's no, who cares about mysterious monkeys and undefined and whatnot, all these kind of different names that has no history. No one cares. And so it's important that it's sustainable for the players, of course, but also the teams. And that's where the teams need to come together right now and work towards this model. And hopefully, as time progresses and as fast as possible, grow a mutual future where we all, we can all compete, but we're also all allied. Because make no mistake, every football club in the world competes against each other, and they probably all hate each other, but they also work together. And that's where VESA is a good thing, whether people want it or not. And I don't know if VESA is the future of esport. It might be under some different name, but it's needed right now, and that's why it's the public in particular perceives it as this evil corporation created by ESL and everything, when in truth, ESL has very little to do with it these days. They just so happen to understand what this the esports community or the professional aspect of community of the scene needed, and they were the only ones with the capability of funding it. Because how else are you going to get the teams together? Oh, you have to pay them, otherwise they're not gonna. Yeah. So in that regard, I think VESA or some sort of VESA is needed, and is needed fast. And the teams need to come together and use the joint forces to negotiate the future of their financial status, basically, and find out, well, how do we make this an appealing league structure for TV channels to buy into?
When you spoke earlier at the Elements Alliance days about the role you would play with if signings would happen or how things went on in the team, are you in your role in North as hands-on? Like, for example, North CS team has already made 2 changes this year. Do they have to run these by you? Do they have to sort of outline their case as to why they should make a change, etc.? Are you involved in that sense? Because in particularly in Counter-Strike, I have to say in the history of Counter-Strike, that's a game where most orgs had to be pretty hands-off. You know, the players, it's usually the in-game leader, in fact, who decides that sort of a thing. Have you been able to have input in that respect? Is that what your role encompasses?
Oh yeah, it's you know, obviously, so I don't help with anything pertinent to Counter-Strike in itself. You know, I don't tell them this is how you play Cobblestone, or you should throw your grenades like this. That'll obviously, that's not a part of my everyday dealings. But on a top level, and so essentially my job is to make sure that North is winning on the long run. The coach's job is that North is winning right now, and the player's job is that they are all performing at their highest level right now as well, right? So yeah, when we do a change, ultimately I'm the final decider. So in this case, if Magisk is put on the bench, that is my call and my call alone. Do I get input from the players? Yeah, no doubt. I'd be dumb not to. You know, if everyone loved playing with Magisk and everyone said he's, you know, by far our best player, do you think I'm going to bench him? No, obviously not. So yeah, the final word is with me, and I then, you know, obviously have a lot of input from everywhere, you know, my own included, and it's ultimately my decision with top level decisions like this that is pertinent to the game, and then how they play the game is obviously their dealings. So everything around the team and everything that is, you know, these big changes with the team, where they play from, which tournaments they go to, which players are in the active lineup, and these things are ultimately my decision.
So the final word in North is with you.
Yes.
And the final word in this interview is with you. So do you have a final message or somebody you want to thank or say hello to?
Sure. I'd like to thank everyone I've worked with throughout time, both the good and the bad, because the good people I've worked with are the ones who's kept me in this industry and made me love it, and the bad people are the ones who's made me or given me enough experience to know how to do my job and what not to do. And I appreciate all of them in each their own way.
All right. Mange tak.
Mange tak.
I'm Device from Australia, and welcome to Foreign's YouTube channel. It's a joke-free zone.